I am so happy that the tone is LGBT is no longer being tolerated. It's it's going to be protected. We're no longer an outsider. We're being fought for. People are on our side about this, even though many of us have been complicit in letting this happen. They are very, very clear about gays aren't something that's bad, but gender ideology and hurting children are something that's bad. It's like someone standing up for us for once instead of us having to stand up for ourselves. It's kind of nice to have that support.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the LGB Alliance USA News Roundup for May 2nd, 2025. We are here with Joss, Scott, and me, Ariane. First, a summary of the news. Penn found in violation of Title IX. The Georgia governor signs a bill protecting women's sports. California rejects bill protecting female prisoners. The U.S. Attorney General issues memo announcing enforcement of policies against transitioning minors, and the HHS releases landmark review on youth gender medicine. And we'll start with you, Joss.
Thanks, Ariane. In February, the Education Department announced an investigation into the University of Pennsylvania, San Jose State University, and the Massachusetts Interscholastic Athletic Association for violating Title IX by allowing trans-identified male students to compete on women and girls sports teams. After conducting the investigation, the department found that the University of Pennsylvania did, in fact, violate Title IX provisions. This past Monday, April 28th, the Education Department sent the university a resolution agreement and gave them 10 days to come into compliance. Should the university fail to meet the resolution stipulations, the Education Department plans to refer the university's noncompliance to the Justice Department. The resolution agreement requires the university to ensure women's sports are single-sex going forward, and send letters of apology to the female athletes who endured sex discrimination when the university allowed trans-identifying male Leah Thomas, to train with and compete on the University of Penn women's swim team. Further, the university must erase Thomas's records, awards, or any similar recognition he received for Division I swimming competitions. The university president, J. Larry Jameson, stated last month that the school, quote, followed NCAA rules and applicable law as they existed then, and that we now comply with NCAA policy and the law as they exist today, end quote. Jameson's choice to use the university's compliance with NCAA guidelines as his excuse for why the school violated Title IX is bonkers to me. The NCAA is a nonprofit org originally established to regulate player safety, which is known for prioritizing male athletic programs over female athletic programs, and has been characterized as a cartel by economists. It's such an extremely weak excuse from the University of Pennsylvania president. It made me think of the saying about ignorance of the law. I think this quote by Walter Russell perfectly encapsulates the folly of those who prioritized NCAA guidelines over Title IX mandates. Quote, man's ignorance of the law of love in personal and world relationships will not serve as an excuse to save him from disaster. Wealth cannot be acquired from others by might, for wealth thus taken will impoverish him who takes anything which is not given, nor can power be thus acquired, for the weakness of the despoiled will prevail against the might of the despoiler, end quote. And now to Scott for more news on sports, this time out of Georgia. Scott?
Thanks, Joss. Monday, April 28th, Georgia joined 26 other states that protected women's and girls' sports when Governor Brian Kemp signed Senate Bill 1 into law. The bill, known as the Fair and Safe Athletic Opportunities Act, or the Riley Gaines Act of 2025, bans biological males from participating in women's sports across Georgia. The bill requires students to participate on sport teams according to their biological sex, not gender identity, at all grade levels, including college. Let me be clear, this is not a trans sport ban. Trans-identifying athletes can still participate in Georgia schools' sports, just based on their sex, not gender. It also requires a separate restroom, locker room, and sleeping facilities for men and women and girls and boys at the athletic events and establishes a route to challenge schools that violate the law. Riley had this to say about the law, quote, 3 years after I and dozens of other D1 female athletes were forced to compete against a man in a Georgia pool, the Riley Gaines Act of 2025 is now law. It is an honorable lifetime to know our stories help shed light on a great problem of rampant gender ideology that means women are victims of government-facilitated sex discrimination, end quote. Now moving to an update from California. On Tuesday, April 29th, the California Senate Public Safety Committee voted down Bill SB 311, proposed by Republican Shannon Grove, that would have protected female prisoners from male inmates. More specifically, SB 311 would have banned males from being transferred to women prisons if they have a history of sexually assaulting women. Furthermore, the bill would have created special sections of women's prisons for trans-identified male prisoners, deliberately to ensure female prisoners' safety and privacy. Many people came to Sacramento to support the bill, including members of the groups of Women's Are Real, Our Duty, and the Women's Liberation Front. But there were also trans rights activist protesters, including some saying expletives about TERFs. What is incredible about this latest episode of the women's prison wars is how reasonable this bill was, yet it was still rejected. Only trans-identified male prisoners with a history of sexual violence against women would be required to go to men's prisons. Other trans-identified males would be allowed in women's prisons, just into a special ward to preserve the safety of female prisoners. In other words, the bill is conscious of safety concerns of both the female and trans-identified male prisoners alike. This shouldn't be considered controversial. And now to Ariane.
Thank you, Scott. Now, if we are seeing inertia from California on the prison issue, we are seeing movement at the federal level regarding the medicalization of trans-identified youth. And we have some pretty big news stories to report on that front. As we have mentioned in previous reporting, in January, the Trump administration had issued an executive order called, quote, Protecting Children from Chemical and Surgical Mutilation, unquote, which attempted to crack down on the practice of medically transitioning minors in various ways. Sections 8A and B of this order prioritized enforcement of protections against female genital mutilation. Now we are learning that on April 22nd, Attorney General Pam Bondi has released a memorandum saying that laws against female genital mutilation will be used against doctors who are involved in the medical gender transition of minors. The memo reads, quote, The Department of Justice will not sit idly by while doctors, motivated by ideology, profits, or both, exploit and mutilate our children. Under my watch, the department will act decisively to protect our children and hold accountable those who mutilate them under the guise of care. I am putting medical practitioners, hospitals, and clinics on notice. In the United States, it is a felony to perform, attempt to perform, or conspire to perform female genital mutilation, FGM, on any person under the age of 18. That crime carries a maximum prison sentence of 10 years per count. I am directing all U.S. attorneys to investigate all suspected cases of FGM under the banner of so-called gender-affirming care or otherwise, and to prosecute all FGM offenses to the fullest extent possible. Unquote. Bondi's memo also floats using existing regulations on drug safety and consumer fraud protection. This memo was leaked to journalist Chris Geidner, who published it on the Law Dorks Substack on April 23rd. Geidner, who is clearly not sympathetic to Bondi or her stance on trans issues, emphasized that the memo is not yet the law. However, more recently, on May 1st, the National Law Review reported that on April 25th, the Attorney General filed a notice in federal court in Washington advising it on the memo. And that brings us to another huge story on federal policy on pediatric transition. On Thursday, May 1st, the Department of Health and Human Services released their landmark review on youth gender medicine. The full report is 409 pages long and is called, quote, Treatment for Pediatric Gender Dysphoria Review of Evidence and Best Practices, unquote. It would be fair to call it the American version of the CAST review, the British report released a year ago, which highlighted the lack of evidence for the efficacy of medical transition for minors. The CAST review led to the UK banning puberty blockers for minors except in clinical trial settings. Given its length, it would be impossible to do justice to the full context of the HHS report in just this news roundup. So we encourage viewers to check out the full report and/or the 9-page executive summary, and we'll link to both in the show notes. But the report is a tour de force of virtually every dimension of the youth transgender medical controversy, including the history of medical transition, the international context of the debate, the overview of the evidence of the medical outcomes of transition, the problem with WPATH's guidelines, the ethics of the language used in the gender affirmation model, and more. And the conclusions of the report are not surprising, that the evidence for the efficacy of medical transition, especially for minors, is lacking, and that there are risks associated with medical interventions like surgeries and hormones. As the report states on page 10, quote, nevertheless, the gender-affirming model of care includes irreversible endocrine and surgical interventions on minors with no physical pathology. These interventions carry risk of significant harms, including infertility/sterility, sexual dysfunction, impaired bone density accrual, adverse cognitive impacts, cardiovascular disease and metabolic disorders, psychiatric disorders, surgical complications, and regret. Meanwhile, systematic reviews of the evidence have revealed deep uncertainty about the purported benefits of these interventions. Unquote. I am very happy to find that the report did not shy away from talking about the link between sex change operations and homosexuality and homophobia. Indeed, there are 30 references to the word homosexual and homosexuality in the report, in addition to 13 mentions of the word lesbian and 7 references to gay. And if you look at the context of this vocabulary, it includes discussion of the disproportionately high rate of same-sex attraction among those who transition. It also acknowledges the role that anti-gay discrimination might have played in encouraging transition. Take section 3.4, for example, which talks about the outcomes for adult gender transition in a Dutch cohort, which on page 49 quotes endocrinologist Christian Hamburger as saying in 1953, quote, no less than 10 women say, in so many words, that they want their sex changed in order to be able to marry their female friend or have a relationship legalized, unquote. The HHS report goes on to say in that paragraph, quote, also apparently ignored was the related possibility that transition may appeal to young gay men and lesbians suffering from social disapproval of their homosexuality, unquote. The next section discussed Hamburger's research on hundreds of people who wanted to undergo sex changes and found that, quote, homosexuality predominated among the men and was universal among the women, unquote. In fact, he was literally unable to find a single woman in his study that admitted to heterosexuality. This was back in the middle of the 20th century, mind you. And that's just a taste of what this report says on the topic. Pages 227 to 228 go on to talk about the huge overrepresentation of LGBT people amongst the cohort for the original Dutch protocol, which popularized the medical transition of gender dysphoric minors. The report says on page 228, quote, given the medical profession's history of pathologizing and medicalizing same-sex attraction, serious justice-related concerns are raised by the overrepresentation of gay, lesbian, and bisexual adolescents among patients receiving unproven interventions that adversely impact fertility and sexual function, unquote. Like I said, there's more, and we can't cover it all here. All I can say is that this is a real milestone, that a federal agency is able to produce a report that takes seriously the link between homophobia and transgender healthcare. Hat tip to Glenna Goldis for drawing attention to the HHS report's discussion of homosexuality on X. Now, the outstanding question is what impact this review will have on the US. Could it have the same impact here as the Cass review did in the UK? Well, there are some reasons for being skeptical. First, unlike the UK, the US does not have a national healthcare system for the federal government to impose its orders on. Rather, we have a complex network of federal, state, and private healthcare providers that are not all on the same page. Second, the political environment in the US is quite polarized, as I'm sure most of you have noticed. And I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of liberal, Trump skeptical judges refuse to use evidence coming out of this administration. So who knows what's going to happen? And I'm curious what you think about it, Joss and Scott.
You know, it can be compared with the Cass report, but this seems to be coming out with both barrels blazing. But the Cass report was very measured. It had a very even tone, but this is you can tell that this government, this current administration is not having it anymore. They're going after people and they're using what will get people's attention, fear. They're going to go ahead and say, we will litigate against you. And I think that's what it's going to take for people to understand that this is not right to do this to children, to feed them an ideology, convince them to think something, and then have them take drastic measures. I agree with this. I'm so happy I was born when I was born to be able to come out to such an accepting community and not have further confusion by an ideology telling me that because I like to do different things, I'm obviously in the wrong body. No one's in the wrong body. And this helps that.
I love the way you put that, Scott, and I have to agree. And I'm really surprised to see such a document by the US. I can't wait to read it. I'm really excited to hear also the references to homosexuality, the focus on the LGBT perspective. That's really important. And that's what our group has been saying this whole time, is that our perspective is very unique because we come at it from the same sex-oriented side of the street. It is our community that is disproportionately affected by gender ideology, and unfortunately, we let the wolves in the hen house. Like our community did this to itself. So I'm really glad to see that differentiation noted in this document.
I agree. Many of us are complicit in this whole thing, and I can see how that happens. You know, we all want to be accepting of everyone, but we have accepted ourselves into this corner that we need to step out.
And I agree with you, Scott, about how this report, if anything, seemed more forceful than the Cass review. The Cass review actually did hedge quite a bit. It sort of like just said, well, there's not enough evidence. It didn't really talk so much about, both in the report, but also the interview I heard with Dr. Cass. She didn't really talk about like the risks of say puberty blockers so much. This report was much more scathing, really.
It was a
About
call to arms.
Yes, exactly. It was a call to arms. And so I actually like that. I'm glad that they didn't try to hedge too much. But I thought rhetorically, it wasn't like some stereotypically, Trumpian tweet. Like rhetorically, it was like the tone was good, but the data was very scathing.
I am so happy that the tone is LGBT is no longer being tolerated. It's going to be protected. And I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, but we're no longer an outsider. We're being fought for. People are on our side about this, even though many of us have been complicit in letting this happen. They are very, very clear about gays aren't something that's bad, but gender ideology and hurting children are something that's bad. It's like someone standing up for
Yeah.
us for once instead of us having to stand up for ourselves. It's kind of nice to have that support.
Yeah, I agree, because they didn't have to go that route. And there's so many people in the Trump administration, and some of them are going to be much more in the classic social conservative Heritage Foundation mold that probably wants to would be fine throwing LGB under the bus. At least some of them would. I don't want to make a caricature of like everyone who's on that side, but they did choose to do this route of actually, like you were saying, fighting for LGB. I'm very happy to see that.
I want to also mention this is a massive departure from the previous administration, where we had Assistant Secretary for Health was Admiral Rachel Richard Levine for Health and Human Services, and to get this report from that same group in a different administration is just, it's night and day.
Yes,
It's absolutely night and day.
absolutely. I don't want to move too far off this, but I do want to talk about Riley Gaines. I do want to mention how happy I am that this is going on, because I remember before I was part of the LGBT Alliance, I was, sitting outside watching a YouTube news thing. It's like, why is Riley being so mean? But the more I watched, the more like, that man is 6'4" or something. That whole thing started my journey into like really taking a look at what's going on and waking up a little bit about gender ideology. And to see this happen 3 years later or 4 years later, that we're on the other side of the looking glass, and things are really coming forward for the protection of women's sports in women and girls. It's not a quiet murmur anymore. It's a roar. And I think it's exactly what it needs to be. And we need to get louder.
And speaking of Riley Gaines, she also recently came back to speak at San Francisco State University. I forget if it was last year or a couple years ago, where she went to SF State to speak, and she was basically held hostage
She was
by the
attacked.
protesters. It was pretty scary. But this time she came and she had better security. And there were also I know some people who were involved who came to support her, and I think it was on the Women Are Real podcast. You can hear one of their episodes. They talk about this most recent visit of Riley Gaines, and they were saying that it seemed like the TRA protesters just seemed very low energy this time around. Like, so hopefully that's a sign in the right direction, that people are kind of like, they know that this might not be a winning fight for them now.
Are they getting activist fatigue? Are they?
Uh, Jordan Peterson said when he gives talks and he didn't want to be rioted against, he just did an early talk, like at 8 a.m. No one wants to get up at 8 a.m. to riot, because they only want to riot when they're up and awake. Yeah, maybe they're beginning to realize that getting up and yelling at someone is just not the way to do it. But that's what they do. They yell and they stomp.
Yeah, I think part of it too might be, and I don't know if you've noticed this as well, but I haven't seen a lot of the resistance to Trump. Like, I haven't seen the trans issue brought to the forefront so much, just on the street, of people who are angry about Trump. Like, I live somewhere very liberal, and there are a lot of people who are very upset about Trump. I haven't heard so many people make the trans issue to be their big reason for being angry about him. So it could be that's just not the issue right now, that progressives are rallying behind.
I will say leave it to NPR to always come back to the trans issue, because I happened to be listening to it the other day, I think yesterday, and the speaker was talking about Project 2025. Is that the name of that?
Yeah.
Yeah, they sort of ended with that whole, like, this is a focus on trans and against trans people and trans identity and da 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 da. Like it, and I later told my girlfriend, like, it seems like every time I turn on NPR, I can't turn it off without having heard some pro trans story from that allegedly unbiased news source. It's just, there's nothing unbiased about it, and hasn't been for years now, unfortunately.
Yeah, they are doubling down hard because they are too far into this hole. And I don't know what they're going to do, but even NBC is beginning to buckle. I saw a newscast talking about the other side of gender ideology. In England, after the Supreme Court said women are actually women, suddenly a lot of the MPs are starting to walk back their comments about, I don't know what a woman is. And many of the gender critical YouTube people who cover that are not letting them get away with it. It's like, oh, now you know what this means. Where were you when this was all going down? For our viewers, I don't know, but Scotland was much further down the rabbit hole with this than it has happened in America. I feel that's my opinion. I'm not saying it is right. They were much more involved with gender ideology. It was much more ingrained, and they had a much more public support for it. So this turn, which is going to reverberate throughout the world. Well, actually, honestly, this is affecting a lot of first world countries, America and Europe. But it's a big change that if news organizations who have been loyal to the gender ideology, to the trans activists, if they're beginning to crack, then it means it's happening. The tide is actually officially turning.
Yeah, and it'll be curious to see how the reverberations continue to go, because some areas are slower to move on gay rights and then also on the trans issue. I wonder how like if it'll be a trickle down situation, or if those other areas will kind of make a quick response to not medicalize their youth. Like learn from the mistakes that were made already.
It would be interesting to see how far Title IX is going to affect other areas. I mean, do we know anything more about Maine? Are they winning any of their lawsuits? Or I know they're trying to get back at Trump and slow it, but
I think the main issue is very new because they've just levied those lawsuits, Pam Bondi has. So I think it's fairly new, but it's a whole cluster. Right? It's a University of Pennsylvania, like all of those different groups are under investigation. And so now we're getting the results of those investigations. And I have a pretty strong feeling they're going to go full guns at all of them. So
yeah,
and that's the education department. And Candace Jackson, I don't know what role she's playing, but she's working for the Department of Education again, right?
I believe so.
Yeah. So she's like, Candace Jackson is on it. So I can't wait to see what happens.
And we'll cover it here. That's going to be something we're going to be looking at very heavily on this news segment.
Yeah, we'll absolutely be on it and keeping you covered on the sports issue and, of course, the prison issue, all these issues. So thank you, everyone, for joining us, and we hope to see you again next time. Goodbye.